The Roman Empire is often celebrated for its feats of conquest, architectural wonders, and imperial grandeur. But hidden beneath its majestic surface lies a world of shocking depravity. While stories of emperors and warriors dominate the history books, the sexual practices of ancient Rome were far darker than anyone dares to imagine. From the cruel sexual exploitation of slaves to the horrifying rituals in the name of religion, the Romans pushed the boundaries of sexual morality to a terrifying extreme. What happens when power and depravity collide? You're about to discover the darkest, most disturbing sexual practices the empire ever concealed. In the Roman Empire, sexuality wasn't just a private affair, it was a reflection of power and status. The upper-class senators, patricians, and emperors had the wealth and authority to indulge in whatever desires they wished, no matter how depraved. But wait, it gets worse. These men didn't just see sexual pleasure as a personal right, they viewed it as a vital part of their dominance. To be a Roman man was to assert control over everything, including your slaves, your wives, and even the bodies of young boys. Even worse, the sexual exploitation of slaves was not just about personal gratification, it was institutionalized. Male and female slaves alike were treated as objects, their bodies at the mercy of their masters. A master could choose any slave, regardless of age or gender, and force them into sexual servitude. The brutal reality for male slaves included the practice of pederasty, where young boys were seen as sexual partners for older men. This wasn't just an act of lust, it was considered an essential part of a boy's education, a way to teach them discipline and loyalty to the state. And it gets weirder. The upper classes didn't just use slaves in private, they paraded their sexual conquests openly. A master with a beautiful concubine or a young slave boy was seen as a symbol of power and wealth. Being seen with these sexual possessions was a mark of social superiority. The display of ownership wasn't just a personal indulgence, it was a public declaration of dominance in a society where one's worth was measured by the ability to control others. But the craziest part? This wasn't confined to men. Women, even those of noble birth, had little autonomy over their sexual lives. Their marriages were often more about securing political power than personal choice, with the sexual lives of the elite women often in the hands of their husbands, whose desires were the law. Women, slaves, and young boys were all caught in the tangled web of sexual dominance that defined Roman society. In ancient Rome, slavery wasn't just about labor, it was about total domination over every aspect of a person's life, especially their sexuality. Slaves were considered property, and their bodies were not their own. Whether male or female, slaves were at the mercy of their masters, whose desires could be fulfilled without question or punishment. But wait, it gets worse. Masters didn't just use slaves for household chores or manual labor. They exploited them for sexual pleasure, turning them into mere objects for gratification. Even worse, the sexual exploitation of slaves wasn't just an occasional abuse, it was woven into the very fabric of Roman society. The practice of having sexual slaves was so ingrained that it was considered normal. Wealthy men, especially in the elite class, often purchased slaves specifically for sexual purposes. These women were forced into sexual servitude, often as concubines, while men were used for the sexual satisfaction of their masters or other wealthy men. If a slave had the misfortune of being attractive, their fate was sealed. They were seen as nothing more than a tool for pleasure, their consent utterly irrelevant. And it gets weirder. But the sexualization of slaves wasn't limited to a private affair, it was a public spectacle. Roman society, obsessed with wealth and status, viewed slaves as symbols of power. To be seen with a beautiful, submissive slave wasn't just a mark of personal indulgence, it was a way of flexing one's dominance and reinforcing social superiority. A wealthy Roman man, especially one with access to multiple slaves, was viewed as being above reproach. His slaves were expected to please him in any way he saw fit, whether through sexual acts or other forms of servitude. But the craziest part? It wasn't just about pleasure, it was about control. Masters, in their quest to assert dominance, would often subject their slaves to humiliation and violence. Slaves were seen as disposable, their lives worth little more than the value of their labor or the pleasure they could provide. For male slaves, it was not uncommon for them to be used for sexual purposes by their masters and even other men. This was not a hidden aspect of Roman life. These relationships were woven into the very public fabric of Roman society. Here's the sickest twist. The concept of sexual submission was so ingrained in Roman society that it wasn't even viewed as a crime or moral failing. In fact, some philosophers defended these acts, arguing that they were necessary for a man's development or a way to strengthen the state's power. Slaves had no voice, no agency, and no chance of escape from the sexual demands placed upon them. They were bound not just in chains, but in the most intimate and degrading ways imaginable, their bodies objects of both public and private ownership. In the Roman world, sex wasn't just an act, it was a part of religious worship. For the Romans, the sacred and the sexual were often intertwined, with many deities linked directly to fertility and sexual desire. One of the most disturbing and revealing examples of this was the god Priapus, a figure whose very existence was built around the grotesque and explicit. But wait, it gets worse. Priapus wasn't just worshipped in private rituals. His image was a common fixture in public spaces, from gardens to homes, reminding everyone that sexual domination was a key part of Roman religious life. Even worse, Priapus, the god of fertility, was depicted with an oversized, permanent erection, an image meant to symbolize not just sexual power, but the overwhelming force of male dominance. This god's very form was a symbol of sexual aggression, and statues of him were placed in homes and public gardens as a protection against evil spirits, but also as a constant reminder of sexual control. His presence was so ubiquitous that Romans would make offerings of fruits, vegetables, and even prostitutes at his altars to ensure fertility and prosperity, blending sexual practices with religious devotion. And it gets weirder. Priapus wasn't the only deity in Roman culture associated with sexuality. The god Bacchus, the Roman counterpart to Dionysus, represented wine, revelry, and wild, uninhibited behavior. His festivals, the Bacchanalia, were infamous for their extreme indulgences in both alcohol and sex. These celebrations, initially private, eventually became public affairs where orgies and sexual rites were not only accepted but expected. The boundaries between the sacred and the profane completely dissolved during these festivals, with participants engaging in sexual acts under the belief that such indulgence would honor the gods and bring prosperity. But the craziest part? Bacchus's worship didn't just involve physical acts of pleasure, it was a form of surrendering control. The Romans believed that by engaging in orgies and sexual acts during the Bacchanalia, they were tapping into a primal, uncontrollable force that would ensure their own fertility and the empire's success. During these festivals, everyone, from the lowest plebeians to the highest elites, participated in ritualistic sexual acts that blurred the lines between devotion and debauchery. Bacchus was worshipped in a state of drunken ecstasy, with sexual excess seen as a path to spiritual enlightenment. Here's the sickest twist. These religious festivals were often tightly controlled by the state, with officials organizing the events to ensure that sexual rituals were carried out according to tradition. However, as these festivals grew in size and number, they became harder to control. The Roman Senate eventually attempted to suppress the Bacchanalia, fearing the chaos and moral decay that the unchecked sexual behavior symbolized. In 186 BCE, the Senate declared that the Bacchanalia had become too dangerous to allow, fearing that the unchecked indulgence in sex and revelry could lead to a loss of social and political order. Yet even the Senate's intervention didn't stop the deeper currents of sexual ritual that had already become embedded in Roman society. And it gets weirder. The worship of Bacchus and Priapus wasn't limited to just festivals and public spaces. It also infiltrated the private lives of Romans. Images of Priapus and Bacchus adorned homes, reminding everyone that the Roman world was defined by sexual power. Even the most intimate of spaces, like private gardens, were filled with images of Priapus, turning every part of Roman life into a space of sexual and religious power. What began as religious devotion gradually became a societal norm, and soon the notion of sexual dominance was not just a private affair, but a cultural identity. But the craziest part? The Roman belief in fertility as a divine right extended to their approach to sexual rituals. Fertility wasn't just about having children, it was about having control over every aspect of life, including death. Priapus and Bacchus were symbols of life and death, of creation and destruction. In the hands of Roman worshippers, sex became a tool not just for pleasure, but for maintaining control over life itself, as well as over the spirits and forces that governed both the physical and spiritual worlds. In the Roman Empire, sexuality and education went hand in some of the most disturbing ways. One of the most normalized, yet horrifying practices was pederasty, a sexual relationship between an adult man and a young boy, often used as a form of education for the youth. But wait, it gets worse. These relationships weren't just about sexual indulgence. They were seen as a method of introducing young boys to the power structures of Roman society. The older man wasn't just a lover, he was a teacher, guiding the boy through a twisted form of education that emphasized submission and obedience. Even worse, the young boys involved were often from the lower classes, making them vulnerable to the whims of the upper echelons of Roman society. It wasn't uncommon for young boys to be chosen by older men for these relationships, as it was believed to be an essential step in their moral and physical development. But the craziest part, these relationships were institutionalized. They were seen as a natural part of a boy's transition from childhood to adulthood, with the sexual aspect being viewed as a necessary evil in the training of the next generation of Roman men. And it gets weirder. While many of these relationships began as a form of mentorship, they were not consensual in any modern sense. The older man held all the power, and the boy, often as young as 12 or 13, had little to no say in the matter. But the craziest part, the boy's submission wasn't seen as a violation, it was expected. The relationship was justified as a way to instill virtue, strength, and loyalty to the Roman state. The boy was not just educated in the ways of citizenship and honor. He was taught his place in the rigid social hierarchy, where submission to authority was paramount. Here's the sickest twist. These relationships were romanticized and glorified in Roman literature. The older man, typically of high social standing, was portrayed as a wise and noble figure, someone who would guide the boy toward greatness. But underneath this veneer of nobility, the reality was that these relationships were grounded in manipulation, control, and sexual dominance. The older man had complete authority, using the boy not just for pleasure, but to reinforce societal power structures. It wasn't about love or care. It was about power. And it gets worse. The psychological toll of these relationships on the boys was largely ignored. The emotional and physical scars left by these practices were seldom acknowledged. The boy's submission was seen as part of his education, as if the act of submission itself was a form of growth. The boy's well-being was of no concern to the men who engaged in these relationships. They were viewed as tools for teaching loyalty and virtue, and their pain was secondary to the social need to maintain control. But the craziest part? Even though some Roman philosophers later criticized the practice, it was still widely accepted within certain circles of Roman society. The act of pederasty was deeply tied to the idea of masculinity, where an older man's ability to dominate a younger boy was seen as a reflection of his power. Even as Rome's empire declined, the legacy of pederasty continued to linger, influencing later periods in history, where the power dynamics of older men and young boys would reappear in different forms across cultures. In ancient Rome, gladiatorial games were not just about bloodshed and combat. They were also steeped in sexual power dynamics and the objectification of human bodies. But wait, it gets worse. Gladiators, men forced to fight in the arena for the entertainment of the masses, were often revered for their physical prowess. However, they were not just seen as warriors, they were also sexual commodities, objects of desire for both men and women in the audience. Their bodies, covered in scars and muscle, were sexualized and admired, turning them into symbols of both violence and desire. Even worse, gladiators were not just fighters, they were sexualized symbols of strength and submission. The power they displayed in the arena was admired, but it also made them the targets of sexual conquest. Wealthy Romans, including emperors and high-ranking officials, often saw gladiators not only as men to admire for their combat skills, but also as men to possess sexually. The craziest part? These men were often slaves or prisoners of war, stripped of their agency, and forced to submit to the desires of their masters, both in the arena and in the bedroom. And it gets weirder. The sexualization of gladiators didn't end once the games were over. Many gladiators were kept as sexual companions for their masters and other elites. These men, who were supposed to embody strength and combat prowess, were reduced to objects of sexual pleasure, their bodies no longer just instruments of war but tools for the gratification of the powerful. Gladiators, who fought for their lives in brutal combat, were often used to satisfy the desires of wealthy Romans, regardless of their own wishes or well-being. But the craziest part? This sexual exploitation wasn't limited to the elite. The spectators in the arena, regular Romans, also saw gladiators as objects of lust and desire. The gladiator fights were not only about watching men battle to the death, but also about seeing these strong, muscular bodies pushed to their limits, naked and vulnerable. The crowd didn't just cheer for the victor, they cheered for the display of strength, the submission, and the bloodshed. Gladiators became the ultimate symbol of both dominance and submission, caught in a cycle of violent entertainment and sexual objectification. Here's the sickest twist. The most famous gladiators, those who became crowd favorites, were sometimes able to earn a measure of freedom or wealth. But many still found themselves trapped in the cycle of sexual exploitation, as their fame often came with the price of being desired by those in power. Gladiators were sometimes auctioned off to the highest bidder, who would not only own their fighting abilities but their bodies as well. Sex became part of the price for their fame and for their survival in a society that saw their worth as little more than entertainment and pleasure. And it gets worse. The brutality of the games and the sexual exploitation that came with them were deeply intertwined. The gladiatorial contests were not just about combat, it was about control, power, and submission on every level. The spectators who cheered for the blood and gore were also participating in a ritual of dominance, not only over the bodies of the gladiators, but over their very humanity. The more a gladiator suffered in the arena, the more his body became an object of desire and an object to be conquered. But the craziest part? As the gladiatorial games became more popular, the sexualization of the fighters increased. The more brutal the fights, the more the gladiators were revered and objectified. The games were no longer just spectacles of violence, they were performances of dominance, where spectators could not only watch men die but also see them as living, breathing symbols of power and submission. In the Roman Empire, the concept of childhood was radically different from our own. Children, particularly girls, were viewed not as innocent beings but as property to be owned, used, and traded. Sexual exploitation of young girls wasn't just an unfortunate reality, it was a normalized part of society. But wait, it gets worse. As soon as a girl reached puberty, she was often married off to an older man, sometimes decades older, in order to solidify political alliances or increase wealth. The craziest part? These marriages weren't about love or mutual respect. They were about power. Fathers traded their daughters as commodities, seeing them as tools for gaining status, land, and influence. Even worse, girls as young as 12 were frequently married to men who were not only much older, but also often already married, or with multiple concubines. And it gets weirder. These girls were expected to begin their sexual lives immediately after their wedding, with little to no consideration for their emotional or physical development. But the craziest part? The Roman legal system allowed men to take full control over their wives' bodies, and these young girls were legally required to fulfill their husbands' sexual needs. No protection, no recourse, and certainly no concept of consent. Sexual activity was seen as an obligation, not a mutual act. Here's the sickest twist. While young girls were treated as tools of political and social strategy, young boys weren't exempt from exploitation either. The sexualization of boys in ancient Rome was just as rampant, particularly among the elite. Wealthy Roman men often took young boys as lovers. with these relationships often viewed as a way to strengthen the older man's position by asserting dominance. But the craziest part? These boys were often slaves or from lower social classes, making them completely powerless. Their bodies were seen as disposable, objects for the sexual gratification of powerful men who could afford them. And it gets worse. These sexual relationships between older men and young boys weren't seen as abuse. In Roman culture, these relationships were normalized and even celebrated. Roman society placed great emphasis on the sexual dominance of men over those of lower status, whether women or boys. The older man's role wasn't just to educate the boy, it was to dominate him, both physically and mentally. These boys were often taught that submission was a virtue, that the older man's control over them was a part of their training in becoming Roman men themselves. But the craziest part? Even as this practice spread through Roman society, the damage it caused to the boys involved was completely ignored. The emotional scars were invisible to most Romans, who viewed this process as an important part of Roman male education. The idea that a young boy could suffer psychologically from these experiences was an alien concept to many. Instead, the practice was justified as part of a boy's upbringing, meant to instill loyalty, virtue, and discipline. But the sickest twist? The boys often had no escape, and their status as slaves or lower-class citizens meant they had no legal protection from this exploitation. And it gets worse. Even after the fall of the Roman Empire, the legacy of these practices didn't fade immediately. The normalization of sexual exploitation of children continued to influence various cultures throughout history, lingering in the background and sometimes resurfacing in different forms in later societies. The Roman Empire's ingrained beliefs in male dominance and sexual control over the powerless set a precedent that would echo through generations, leaving a mark on Western history that is still disturbing to confront. In ancient Rome, religious worship wasn't just about rituals of devotion, it was about indulgence and excess. The Bacchanalia, religious festivals held in honor of Bacchus, the god of wine and revelry, were among the most infamous examples of sexualized religious practice. But wait, it gets worse. What began as small, private rituals for a select group of followers eventually spiraled into massive public events where the lines between sacred and profane completely dissolved. These festivals, once intended for wine, dance, and simple worship, became free-for-alls of sexual indulgence. Even worse? The Bacchanalia weren't just about drinking wine and celebrating the harvest, they were a massive release of sexual tension, where orgies and uninhibited acts were seen as part of the religious experience. The Romans believed that engaging in wild sexual acts would appease Bacchus and ensure prosperity for the empire. The festival became a space where anything was allowed, where society's rules were stripped away in favor of unbridled pleasure. But the craziest part? These ceremonies weren't just about personal pleasure, they were a way to connect with the divine, to reach a higher state of ecstasy and spiritual transcendence by giving in to physical lust. And it gets weirder. As the Bacchanalia spread across the empire, they became less about honoring Bacchus and more about indulging in all forms of hedonism. What started as a small group of followers celebrating the god of wine turned into wild gatherings where men and women engaged in sexual acts with complete abandon. But the craziest part? These events weren't confined to the elites or the wealthy ordinary Romans, were encouraged to partake as well. The Bacchanalia were meant to be an expression of Roman unity, a communal indulgence that would ensure the prosperity and fertility of the land. Everyone, from the lowest slave to the highest official, participated in the sexual rituals, breaking down barriers of class and status in the pursuit of divine pleasure. Here's the sickest twist. The Bacchanalia weren't just orgies, they were a reflection of the deep connection between sex and power in Roman society. Sexual acts during these festivals were not only seen as rituals of pleasure, but as acts of domination and submission. The ability to indulge in such excess was a symbol of Roman strength, a sign that one could control their impulses and embrace the full power of their sexuality. In a society that placed immense importance on power dynamics, the Bacchanalia were a way to reinforce the idea that those who could indulge in the most depraved acts were the most powerful. And it gets worse. As the Bacchanalia became more widespread, they also became more dangerous. The Roman authorities began to fear the growing power of these festivals, seeing them as a threat to social order. In 186 BCE, the Senate, fearing the chaos these festivals could bring, attempted to suppress them. They saw the Bacchanalia as a potential uprising, where the social hierarchies of Roman life could be overturned by the lawlessness of sexual indulgence. But despite their best efforts, the Bacchanalia continued in secret, becoming a form of rebellion against the moral constraints of Roman life. But the craziest part? Even as the state attempted to shut them down, the influence of the Bacchanalia didn't disappear. They remained a part of the Roman psyche, symbolizing the tension between the public order and the private desires of the individual. Though they were eventually outlawed, the essence of the Bacchanalia, the connection between sex, power, and freedom, continued to influence Roman culture long after the festivals themselves faded into the background. The Roman Empire was ruled by emperors who were not just political leaders. They were absolute powers who controlled every aspect of Roman life, including the sexual lives of those around them. The emperors were considered divine figures, their desires seen as above reproach, and their power extended into the realm of sexual tyranny. But wait, it gets worse. The sexual excesses of the emperors weren't just private affairs, they were public displays of dominance, where the emperor's sexual indulgence became a symbol of his authority and control. Even worse, some emperors, like Caligula, took their power to grotesque extremes. He didn't just indulge in sexual depravity, he demanded that others participate in it. Caligula was notorious for his open sexual affairs with both men and women, and his actions were often meant to humiliate and assert control over the Roman elite. But the craziest part, Caligula went so far as to declare himself a living god, using his sexual acts as part of his divine image. He held orgies at the palace, and in some cases, he even forced senators and their wives to participate. This was not just about pleasure, it was about showing that no one, not even the highest of Rome's officials, could escape his will. And it gets weirder. Caligula's sexual indulgences were just the beginning. Nero, another emperor, took the idea of sexual dominance even further. He didn't just take lovers for pleasure, he married men and forced them into humiliating roles, even going as far as to have his favorite, Sporus, castrated and then paraded as his wife. Nero's sexual relationships were a spectacle, meant not only for his personal satisfaction, but as a demonstration of his complete control over both his empire and those in it. But the craziest part, Nero's sexual acts were not only public, they were part of his political strategy. By humiliating others through sexual domination, he reinforced his image as a ruler who was above all laws and norms. Here's the sickest twist. The emperors didn't just engage in personal sexual acts for pleasure, they used sex as a tool of terror. During Nero's reign, rumors spread that he had his enemies executed in ways that were sexually humiliating. Those who dared challenge Nero's rule often found themselves subjected to cruel, degrading sexual punishments. These acts of humiliation were not just personal vendettas, they were meant to remind the population of the emperor's absolute power. The victims were not just executed, they were subjected to sexual violence as a way of further degrading them. And it gets worse. Caligula and Nero weren't the only emperors who used sex to assert their power. Tiberius, another notorious emperor, engaged in sexual cruelty during his rule. On the island of Capri, he created a sexual playground for himself, where young boys and girls were brought to be sexually exploited at his command. But the craziest part, Tiberius had a system in place where he would observe the sexual acts from behind hidden windows or peepholes, watching as young boys and girls were forced to perform for his pleasure. This wasn't just about indulgence, it was about creating an atmosphere of total control and fear, where no one was safe from the emperor's desires. Here's the sickest twist. The sexual tyranny of these emperors wasn't limited to their private lives. It was woven into the very fabric of Roman politics. The emperor's sexuality was part of his image, part of the power he wielded over Rome. Sex became a tool of control, not just for personal satisfaction, but as a way to assert the emperor's dominance over every aspect of Roman life. The ability to control others sexually was a sign of absolute authority, a way to demonstrate that the emperor was the ultimate ruler, above both the laws of men and the moral code of society. And it gets worse. These sexual displays weren't just about indulgence, they were about power, fear, and humiliation. The sexual relationships of these emperors were a direct reflection of their tyrannical rule, with sex used as a form of punishment, control, and dominance. The emperor's personal sexual indulgences became the foundation for his political strategy, humiliating, dominating, and controlling every aspect of Roman society. And the most disturbing part? These acts of sexual power were often normalized by the very people who served these emperors. The Roman elite, who had once been the masters of the empire, were now the victims of sexual tyranny. As the Roman Empire began to crumble, so too did the extreme sexual practices that had long defined it. But wait, it gets worse. The collapse of Rome didn't just mark the end of political and military power, it also signaled the beginning of a shift in the way Romans viewed sexuality. With the rise of Christianity, which preached chastity, modesty, and moral purity, the once accepted sexual excesses of Roman life started to be seen as immoral, sinful, and, eventually, criminal. Even worse? As Christianity spread throughout the empire, sexual practices that were once normalized and even celebrated began to be demonized. The public orgies, the sexual domination of slaves, the exploitation of young boys. All of it was condemned by the new moral order. The craziest part, the very practices that had been part of Roman culture for centuries became the focus of Christian reformers, who sought to change the way people viewed sex and its role in society. The once accepted idea of sexual power, dominance, and indulgence was gradually replaced by a new moral framework that saw these behaviors as destructive to the soul. And it gets weirder. The decline of the empire didn't just lead to a cultural shift, it led to a complete reimagining of sexuality and power in the Western world. What was once celebrated in the Roman world as an act of divine favor and strength was now viewed as the ultimate sin. But the craziest part, even as Christianity began to shape the moral landscape, many of the practices and ideas about sexual dominance that had been ingrained in Roman society didn't disappear. They simply went underground. The sexual abuse of young boys, the domination of slaves, and the use of sex as a tool of power didn't vanish. They just became more hidden, often wrapped in religious or political rhetoric that justified the behavior. Here's the sickest twist. As Roman sexuality declined, its legacy didn't fade into history. It lived on in the practices of the medieval world. The Church, while trying to instill a new sense of moral purity, still struggled to contain the deeply ingrained attitudes about sex that had been fostered during Rome's peak. In many ways, the empire's sexual excesses simply evolved, finding new forms of expression through the power structures of feudal societies. Even as the empire's sexual practices were condemned, the desire for control, dominance, and submission lingered in the shadows of European culture. And it gets worse. The sexual excesses of Rome might have disappeared from the public eye, but they left an indelible mark on Western civilization. The legacy of Roman sexual dominance and indulgence continued to shape ideas about power, control, and sexual relationships for centuries. The Roman Empire's tolerance of sexual excess gave rise to an era where power dynamics, sex, and exploitation remained intrinsically linked, even in cultures that outwardly rejected those practices. But the craziest part? Despite the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of more conservative Christian values, the shadows of Rome's sexual tyranny would never fully disappear. They continue to echo through history, influencing modern attitudes towards sex, power, and control. Even though the Roman Empire crumbled centuries ago, its sexual practices and ideologies continue to reverberate through the modern world. The Roman Empire didn't just leave behind monumental architecture and legendary military exploits. It left a legacy of sexual exploitation, dominance, and control that became deeply embedded in Western thought and culture. But wait, it gets worse. The values that permeated Roman sexual culture didn't vanish when the empire fell. They subtly influenced everything from medieval society to contemporary sexual politics, creating power structures that persist to this day. Even worse, the normalization of sexual exploitation and domination during Roman times provided a model for future generations. These practices weren't just confined to the dark corners of Roman society, they were woven into the very fabric of its public life. The control of women, the sexual exploitation of slaves, and the sexualized relationships between men and boys all served to reinforce power structures that valued dominance and submission above equality and consent. But the craziest part? Many of these same ideologies continued to be justified in the centuries following the fall of Rome, especially during periods when the power of the church and the state began to impose more conservative social structures. And it gets weirder. Even as the church sought to impose a more restrained and moralistic view of sexuality, the roots of Roman sexual culture remained alive, deeply embedded in the way power and sexuality were linked. While sexual exploitation was pushed into the shadows, the idea that sex was about domination and control continued to shape relationships for generations. But the craziest part? The subjugation of the weak and vulnerable, particularly women and children, remained normalized in many societies for centuries, long after the Roman Empire was gone. Here's the sickest twist. Roman ideas about sexuality and power didn't just linger in the medieval world, they also found a way into modern times. The legacy of objectifying women, the sexual exploitation of children, and the sexualized control of men's bodies persisted in many ways, influencing societal attitudes toward consent, gender, and power. Even though public opinion shifted and laws were passed to protect the vulnerable, the deeply ingrained notion that sex was tied to power continues to shape societal attitudes towards sex and dominance. And it gets worse. In modern times, we see echoes of the Roman Empire's sexualized power dynamics in everything from media and advertising to political discourse. The sexualization of bodies, especially in the entertainment industry, continues to perpetuate the idea that sex is a means of control, a commodity to be bought, sold, or used to manipulate. This legacy of exploitation, established in Rome, still influences how power and sex intersect today. But the craziest part? The Roman Empire, through its unrelenting emphasis on sexual dominance, left a deep scar on human history. Its practices weren't just aberrations of a single culture, they were a warning of how power, control, and sexuality can become so deeply interwoven that it can take centuries to unravel. And that unraveling is still ongoing today. While the Roman Empire's visible monuments, literature, and military exploits may seem like the most significant legacies left behind, its most disturbing inheritance may be the ways it shaped modern views on sex and power. The Roman Empire laid the groundwork for an ongoing obsession with sexual dominance, control, and submission that still permeates cultures today. But wait, it gets worse. While many aspects of Roman sexual culture have been condemned, the power dynamics that were normalized in the empire have proven shockingly resilient, influencing everything from the development of Western legal systems to modern-day issues like consent, objectification, and exploitation. Even worse, Roman sexual practices weren't just about physical domination, they were psychological tools of control. From the sexualization of slaves and children to the glorification of pederasty and sexual violence, Roman culture was steeped in the idea that power was most effectively demonstrated through the complete subjugation of another's body. But the craziest part? These practices didn't disappear after the fall of the empire. Instead, they evolved into more covert forms, finding new expressions in feudal systems, colonialism, and even in modern legal and political structures. What was once the open exploitation of bodies in public arenas became a hidden part of cultural heritage, influencing the way authority is exercised, particularly in sexual relationships. And it gets weirder. The Roman fascination with power and control through sex didn't stop at interpersonal relationships, it also shaped the legal and political order. The Roman Empire's acceptance of sexual domination created a cultural foundation where the strong were allowed to exert their power over the weak. The relationship between emperor and subject, master and slave, and man and woman all reflected the empire's sexual hierarchy. But the craziest part? This hierarchy wasn't just a relic of the past, it continues to be reflected in how power is still structured today, particularly in patriarchal societies where sexual dominance remains an integral part of gender roles and expectations. Here's the sickest twist. The Romans saw their sexual practices as a reflection of their civilization's greatness, justifying the use of sexuality as a means of maintaining power over others. The more subjugated a person was, the more control the dominant class could assert. This sexualization of power didn't just end with the empire. It was absorbed into the political and religious structures that followed, especially Christianity. As the Christian church began to take root in the empire, its teachings on chastity, marriage, and sexual purity were meant to supplant Roman excesses, but the root ideas of sexual control persisted. The concept of power over the body, once openly celebrated, now became embedded in religious doctrine, law, and societal expectations. And it gets worse. The very structure of sexual consent in modern society can still be traced back to Roman practices. Even in the modern era, when legal protections have been put in place to protect against sexual violence and exploitation, many of these issues remain deeply entangled with the historic power dynamics that were normalized in Rome. The Roman Empire's normalizing of sexual violence, domination, and the control of the powerless still resonates in the ways societies view issues like rape, consent, and sexual exploitation today. But the craziest part? The persistent legacy of Roman sexual culture isn't just about the past, it's about how history shapes our present. The Roman ideal of sexual dominance continues to influence our attitudes toward power and control, even in seemingly unrelated sectors of life, whether in politics, entertainment, or the way sexual violence is addressed. Roman sexual practices were not just something that existed in the past. They were the foundation for how we view control, power, and dominance today.